Hey there guys, it's Rob Adams. Thanks again for reading my article in Shutter Mag. This month we're talking about color grading and color correction, and this is a very multifaceted, complex process, which is very subjective, and it's used in many different ways by all types of filmmakers, and to just talk about it generally in a short article is just scratching the surface of what goes into coloring or color grading video footage or film. And I wanted to illustrate some of the processes I spoke about and just give you a visual representation of some of the techniques and some of the things I was talking about, such as Canon C-Log, flat profiles, color correction, matching, that sort of thing. So I have a series of clips here on my timeline. I am working in Final Cut Pro 10, Apple's Final Cut Pro 10. I like this NLE application. I use it for all of my video editing. I'm not against any other systems. This is what we just happen to use. And you'll see here on the top left of the screen, we have a series of video scopes. These are just measurement tools that help us to remain within certain boundaries. For example, we have this circular doodad here called a vector scope. It just helps us to show where different colors are on the color wheel in relation to the frame that we're looking at. And more importantly, over here we have what's called a waveform monitor, and here we're looking at the individual red, green, and blue channels. But this measurement tool will help us to judge our exposure, so we are correctly working within parameters that will be useful on other people's screens and will display correctly on other people's methods of viewing our product. So I wanted to walk through several different clips here and just explain the differences between each of them, how they came out of my camera, and then what we can do to apply color correction and grading and some LUTs to them. So this first clip that you're seeing here on the screen is a clip that was shot in Canon C-Log. And what that is a very flat profile that is used to give you a very basic starting point from which to grade your films. The flatter your image, the more detail you're going to retain in your highlights and shadows. You can see here that I'm shooting this gentleman against a window, and I'm able to expose what is going on outside of the window and what's happening here in the shadow areas of his face and his hand and his shirt and the pen. And that is just because of the incredible amount of dynamic range that my camera gives me when shooting in C-Log mode. Granted, for weddings, C-Log mode is very, it's a more tedious process to grade, so it's not very useful for weddings, and I use it mostly for my documentary and film shooting. But for weddings, I want something that's has a little bit more contrast and is a little bit already graded, if you will, so I have a more efficient workflow to use. But just to illustrate how a LUT, a lookup table, can be applied to footage like this to bring it back to a place that is viewable for your client. Not that you couldn't show this, but sometimes you'll show this to a client and they'll go, wow, it doesn't look very punchy, it doesn't have any contrast, and then you have to explain to them, well, it's shot a certain way because ... To avoid that, we would use what's called a Rec. 709 LUT. And I have this nifty little LUT plugin here, and I'm just going to take this and drag it over to my footage. And then over here in the top right-hand corner of the screen, I can apply, by dropping down this little menu, the Canon C-Log to Rec. 709 LUT. And you'll notice the second I do that, it has applied an S-curve to my footage, and it gives it contrast, and it gives it more color and saturation. And that is just to blanket, across your footage, give it that look. I can also adjust it from here if I want. There's a mix slider, so I can mix in the amount or take away the amount that I want to before I show my dailies to my client. But this is a quick way of adding a color grade. It's a simple S-curve. If you are a photo editor, you already know what an S-curve is. When you work with curves, you're adjusting your highlights, midtones, and shadows relative to the different parts of the image. This next image I'm going to show you is a landscape of the Statue of Liberty over the Hudson River in New York City. It's a very flat image. It was shot with a C-Log, and again, I can just apply that LUT and drop down to the Canon C-Log to Rec. 709, you'll see that it's brightened up the image tremendously, and it really does help. If you want to fine-tune this even more than just your mix slider, you can. If you wanted to add a little bit more contrast, we can adjust the S-curve using our native nonlinear editing system's color tools. If I go over here to the color correction effect preset or plugin or effect, if you will, and I open up the color board here, I have 3 tabs. I have color, saturation, exposure. From here, I can start adjusting different parts of the image. So in my exposure tab, I can drop my shadows to add a little bit more contrast between highlight and shadow, increase my midtones, and then increase my highlights. Now, if you look here on the waveform monitor, you get a representation of where those limits are before you start overexposing things. Obviously, this image is very blue in tone, correct? So we see here on the blue channel, we have a lot more blue. It's elevated over the green and red channels. And if we look at this scope closely, the higher areas here are your highlights, the middle tone areas are right in the middle, and then obviously your shadows are on the bottom. And as we increase and decrease these, you can see how that waveform begins to expand and give us a different exposure. So if I really wanted to crush my blacks, I would drag it all the way down. You see how the blacks here in the darker areas of the image get really, really crunched. We don't want that. The lines here that represent 100 and 0 on the waveform monitor are our limits. So we really don't want to go much beyond or near them if we can avoid it. Avoided it at, as much as we can. So just by adjusting these, I can adjust the amount of contrast, brightness, and saturation that I want in my image. If I wanted to remove blue from, let's say, my highlights, I could use these 3 pucks here, which represent the midtones, highlights, and shadows, and just drag away in a different direction or drag towards to add and remove different color. So that's the basic those are the essentials of color grading is what I'm just doing right there. I'm just manipulating the different parts of the image in exposure, saturation, and color tone. This next image I'll show you here was shot in C-Log, but there's a lot of contrast happening here. We have a lot of darks, we have a lot of highlights. There's a wide range of dynamic range happening here. So if I was going to do this manually, I'd probably want to use some sort of a manual curve adjustment. And I have that in the form of this plugin from Pixel Film Studios called Colorist. And you can see here I have a curves tool, and if I drop that down onto the clip and then navigate over to the clip and open the curves window, now I have a series of curve lines that, just like within Lightroom or any other photo editing program, I can adjust the curves of my image, and I can create my own S-curve here just by manipulating the different parts of this line, which is fantastic. So I'm liking that. I was able to kind of bring out the blue in the sky by dropping the detail down on that. And then just by playing with it, I can get a look that looks good to me. So doing a manual S-curve is always the way to have the maximum amount of control. Now, there are presets that make things a lot easier than doing everything manual like this. This is a great place to start if you're not really comfortable with working with curves and manual adjustments. You can see in these 2 clips here that there's something very wrong with the white balance. The cameraman was not set correctly for the light that was coming in through the window. And then there's this mixed overhead tungsten light that's happening as well. So we can use a plugin that we have called the white balance plugin, oddly enough. And I apply this. Now I can open this plugin, choose the white selector, which is just my eyedropper tool, and click on the image what is supposed to be white. Now, obviously, his shirt is white. It is supposed to be white. When I click that, it will auto-adjust the image white balance. Now, that's a little bit more true based on what the color of the room was at that time. If I want to adjust it even more, I can drag down away from the orange and make it more blue. Same thing for green and magenta if I want to do that as well. So that makes it very easy to color balance or color correct a clip. And you can see the difference when I slide back and forth here. So once again, we'll go ahead and apply our white balance plugin, grab the white selector, and there you go. Much, much more true to form white balance happening in those 2 clips. And then from there, I can continue to grade however I want to grade, whether I want to do it directly in Final Cut, which wouldn't be that hard to do with a clip like this. We'll look at our waveform here. We can see we have a pretty wide waveform because this was shot in my wide DR mode. So we have a nice mix of highlights, midtones, and shadows. But if I wanted to go ahead and add some more contrast and some saturation to this, I could do that by just adjusting the S-curve sliders or pucks here in Final Cut. Maybe we'll take away some of the color saturation in those midtones. And there you go. It's as simple as that. This next clip here is tricky. It was shot in wide DR, not C-Log, so it's not as flat coming out of my Canon C100. And we have some nice tones here. I want to maintain the skin tones. The whites are where they should be, and I'm actually able to expose the World Trade Center or the Freedom Tower here in the background of this image, which is pretty incredible given the amount of light that I had to work with on their faces. So if I wanted to work with an image like this, I don't have the latitude I would, say, with a C-Log or a really flat image, but I do have the ability to grade this very, very nicely, and I would probably go ahead and use my curves tool like I illustrated a second ago, to open the curves window and just bring up the midtones slightly. And we'll play with those highlights to see how I'm bringing back detail into my highlights, into the very bright area back there. And we'll kind of increase those midtones just a little bit, bringing up the faces. Maybe I don't want the shadows so crunched, so I'll lift them back up. And there you go. I'll show you a before and after of this clip, and you can see the difference. The colors are more vibrant, the skin tones are more smooth, and there's a little bit more contrast on this image, so it's much, much nicer. All right, so now let's talk about some presets, and presets can be really helpful in helping you to define a style, or just, go through different styles and figure out what looks good on your footage and then maybe tweak it from there. But there's all different kinds of these out there. There's Red Giant Colorista, there's Magic Bullet Looks, there's all these different ones. I like to use one called FCPX Colorist and FCPX LUT Wedding from Pixel Film Studios. LUT Wedding is really cool because it gives you all these different Rec 709 LUTs that can be applied to flat footage and give it a specific look. So let's go on ahead down here and we'll select our FCPX LUT Wedding plugin. We'll drop it onto our footage, and then up here you can choose from all different presets. Now this program doesn't give you the little thumbnail that shows you the preview of what the effect will look like. You kind of have to go through them on their own, but there are others out there, other programs that do that. Let's just go through and grab, let's see, Wedding Contemporary, and apply that. So that, I don't like the way that looked. It darkened the footage, not my cup of tea. Wedding Cream 3 kind of gave it a more magenta, smooth, milky look to it. Again, not my style. Let's try Wedding Faded 1. Wow, that's pretty drastic. So it gave the footage a wash, and now we can adjust the different parameters. We can add back some contrast. We can add or take away gamma to kind of reduce or enhance that wash effect. We can decrease or increase the brightness to save dynamic range. And of course, we can increase the saturation. So there's all these different ways. What's nice is once you find something you really like, you can save it as an effects preset and then continue to use it on your different footage. So there's all these different types of LUTs that you can use to apply different looks to your footage. And some of them are really harsh. Some of them I just don't like the way they make skin tones look. So you really have to play around with different sets of these and see which ones you really like. So, and it's all going to depend on the different type of footage that you have, how it was shot, at what the color profile was in the camera, that sort of thing. But let's see our next piece of footage here. This was shot in wide DR. It's very contrasty to begin with, and we'll see what we can do here just by choosing a different LUT. Let's go with the Wedding Cream. That just made it blue. Let's go with maybe a different one of those. There you go. So that cooled the image down, gave it a very dark, almost twilight or dawn feel to it. And that's what color grading is meant to do. It's meant to, to enhance a mood or illustrate a mood within your footage. So we can just play around with the gamma here and the different parameters and come across something that might look semi-cool based on what it is I'm going to be editing. So that's how LUTs work. They're very, very simple. Another cool thing you can do is really play with color and hue of different parts of your image. So for example, the groom's coat here is blue. It's completely blue. I can change that by only affecting those colors in my image. So if I go back to my FCPX Colorist plugin and I grab the hue slider and I drag that down and open the window, I can take my blues and I can change it to something different. Here I'm making it more aqua, or I can make it more violet, or I can make it more purple or red, or whatever you want to do. You can play around with these. I can also adjust the different tones in the flower. If I wanted to make this flower more red, I could do that as well. So you have real power in these plugins to help us adjust color, tone, saturation, so on and so forth. This particular image is very cool. I wanted it to be a little bit more warm than what it is. It's a little bit too true to form. I see we have this really warm glow from the candles, but the napkins are a little bit too white for my taste, so we can kind of adjust the overall mood on this as well. And there's several different ways we can do that. We can use our curves. We can use some color balance. Let's grab our color balance here. And this gives us a set of color wheels. And just by playing with the shadows, midtones, and highlights, I can give it the kind of look I want to. Let's play with the highlights a little bit, because these napkins are white and they fall into the highlights, I would say the highlights portion of this image. By dragging it over the wheel over to the yellow, I can increase the amount of yellow saturation there is in the highlight areas. I could also do the same thing for the midtones, and now I've really kind of made this a warmer image just by simply doing that. And I'll show you the before and after. So there's your before, and there's your after. Little bit different mood, warms it up just a touch, and now I can make my fine-tune adjustments to my exposure. And let's just go ahead and use Final Cut's built-in color correction plugin here, or effects color board, I should say. And we'll make the shadows a little bit more prominent. We'll bring up the luminance on the midtones and the highlights itself. And let's increase that saturation so we really get a punchy image here. And there you go. That looks really cool to me. And you can see the before and after and the difference in the image. So again, this is just scratching the surface of color grading and using scopes and color correction, but I hope this gives you a little insight onto how it can be done fairly easily in a nonlinear editing system using some plugins and some LUTs. So once again, thanks so much for reading the article. I hope this was helpful, and look forward to talking to you again next month.